All right, so imagine this, right? You've got this dime in your hand, and sitting right on top of it is this tiny frog.
A frog?
Yeah, from Papua New Guinea.
Wow.
It's called the Pedifront swiftorum,
Okay.
and it's so small, like barely bigger than your fingernail.
Oh, wow.
It really makes you think,
Yeah.
what determines where something like that can even live?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, why there? Why not somewhere else?
Right, exactly.
And that question actually sets the stage for a much deeper exploration.
For sure.
And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this deep dive today.
I'm excited.
So this isn't just about some tiny frog, obviously.
Okay.
This deep dive, we're going to go through this whole chapter called An Introduction to Ecology and the Biosphere.
Okay, great.
So think of it like we're going to get this well-rounded understanding of the main theories and the really important concepts,
Makes sense.
some super interesting research, and even real-world examples
I like it.
that all help explain what shapes where organisms can live,
It's like a puzzle figuring out what pieces fit where.
Exactly.
Okay.
And our mission today is to break down this whole chapter
All right.
and give you a solid grasp of all these ecological principles
Right.
and what they really mean.
Sounds good.
We'll be looking at what influences where we find different species
Yep.
and what makes each biome unique, both on land and in the water.
So both terrestrial and aquatic biomes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a lot to cover.
It is. It is.
But it's really fascinating stuff.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
When we zoom out and think about it,
Yeah.
we're basically trying to understand this intricate web of factors
Okay.
that creates the tapestry of life on Earth.
Right.
From that little frog we talked about to the global patterns we see.
Yeah.
Our goal is to break down this essential knowledge
All right.
so you come away with valuable insights
Yeah.
quickly and thoroughly.
Love it.
Sure.
So to start us off, can you give us a quick definition of ecology? What is it really all about?
Sure. So ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment.
Okay, so it's about relationships.
Yeah, it's all about those relationships, the connections between living things and their surroundings.
Gotcha. And that environment includes other organisms, right?
Absolutely. It's not just the physical stuff like the air, water, and soil.
Okay.
It's also all the other living things in that space.
Right. The whole community.
Exactly. Predators, prey, competitors, even the tiny microbes that help things break down.
So it's this whole web of interactions.
Exactly.
Now, the chapter talks about different levels of studying ecology.
Yes, it's like zooming in and out with a camera.
Okay, I like that analogy.
You can start with just one organism and then zoom out to see the whole planet.
So it's like different scales of focus.
Precisely.
Can you break those down for us a bit?
Of course. So the most basic level is organismal ecology.
Okay.
And this focuses on how an individual organism's body, how it works and how it behaves, helps it survive in its environment.
So it's like, how does a polar bear stay warm in the Arctic?
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Their thick fur and blubber are adaptations for that environment.
Right, so it's about individual survival strategies.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the next level up?
That would be population ecology.
Okay.
And here we zoom out a bit to look at a group of individuals of the same species all living in a particular area.
Like all the polar bears in a certain region of the Arctic.
Precisely. And population ecologists look at things like birth and death rates, how the population size is changing,
Okay.
what resources are available to them.
Gotcha.
Are there a lot of predators? Is disease a big factor?
So it's like understanding the dynamics of that group.
Exactly.
And then from populations, we move to what?
To community.
Communities.
Yeah, so community ecology looks at all the different populations of different species living together in the same area.
Right. So now it's not just polar bears, but also seals and fish and everything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it focuses on how those different species interact with each other.
Do they compete for food? Are there predator-prey relationships? Do any species benefit from each other?
It's like who eats whom and who helps who and who's fighting over what.
Exactly. And community ecology helps us understand how these interactions affect the whole community.
Right. So it's like, how does that web of life work in a particular place?
Yeah, wisely.
And then we zoom out even more.
We do. We move to the level of ecosystem ecology.
Ecosystem. Okay.
So now we're considering the entire biological community in an area, all the living things, plus the non-living factors like the climate, the soil, the water.
Okay, so it's everything in that system.
Exactly. And at this level, we focus on things like energy flow.
Energy flow.
Yeah, how energy moves through the system from the sun to plants to the animals that eat them.
Right, like the food chain.
Exactly. And also how chemical elements like carbon and nitrogen cycle through the ecosystem.
So it's not just who eats whom, but also how the whole system is powered and maintained. Precisely. It's about understanding the big picture processes that keep everything running.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what's beyond ecosystems?
That brings us to landscape ecology.
Landscape ecology, okay?
So a landscape is like a mosaic of different ecosystems
Okay.
that are connected by the movement of energy, materials, and even organisms.
So it's like, how do different ecosystems interact with each other across a larger area?
Exactly. Landscape ecologists might look at how things like roads or rivers
Okay.
affect how animals move between different patches of forest.
Right, so it's like understanding the flow between different types of environments.
Precisely.
And finally, we reach the biggest scale, right?
We do. We reach global ecology.
Global ecology, okay.
This is where we look at the entire biosphere.
Our entire biosphere, wow.
All the ecosystems and landscapes on Earth combined.
Okay.
Global ecologists study things like how global air currents and ocean currents influence the distribution of organisms
Right.
and how elements cycle on a global scale.
So it's like looking at the planet as one giant interconnected system.
Exactly. It's the ultimate big picture perspective in ecology.
It's amazing to see how all these levels connect, starting from that tiny frog and zooming out to the entire planet.
It's all interconnected, yeah.
The chapter even gives these really cool research question examples for each level.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Like at the organismal level, it talks about how flamingos choose their mates,
Right.
which is like a question of behavior and physiology.
Uh-huh.
And then at the global level, it asks how global air circulation affects where different organisms can live.
It's fascinating to see how those different scales connect.
It really highlights the scope of what ecology is all about.
It does. It shows how complex and interconnected life on Earth really is.
Okay, so now that we've got a good understanding of what ecology is and those different levels,
Okay.
the chapter moves into talking about Earth's climate.
Right.
And it makes this point that climate is like this huge influence on where terrestrial organisms can live.
It really is the foundation.
Yeah, so why is climate such a dominant factor?
Well, climate is basically the long-term weather patterns in an area,
Okay.
and it sets the stage for what organisms can survive there.
Right, like if it's too hot or too cold or too dry.
Exactly. Those are all part of climate, the temperature, the precipitation,
Okay.
which includes rain and snow,
Uh-huh.
how much sunlight there is, and even wind patterns.
So all those things together make up the climate.
Yeah, and they all directly affect whether an organism can live in a certain place.
Gotcha. And these global climate patterns, they're mostly driven by the sun and how the Earth moves, right?
Precisely. The chapter has a great diagram showing how the sun's rays hit different parts of the Earth at different angles.
Okay.
And that's why the tropics are so warm, because they get direct sunlight year-round.
Right. And the poles are colder because the sunlight is spread out over a larger area.
Exactly. That difference in solar energy is what drives everything else.
So how does that create the global air circulation and precipitation patterns that we see?
Okay, so picture this. The sun heats up the air at the equator,
Okay.
and that warm, moist air starts to rise.
Right.
As it goes higher, it cools down.
Yeah.
And cooler air can't hold as much moisture, so it releases that moisture as rain.
Oh, so that's why the tropics are so rainy.
Exactly. Now, that high-altitude air has lost most of its moisture,
Okay.
and it flows towards the poles,
Uh-huh.
around 30 degrees north and south latitude. That dry air descends back towards the Earth.
Okay.
And as it descends, it warms up and can hold more moisture again.
Right.
So it starts sucking up moisture from the land.
Oh, so that's why we see deserts around those latitudes.
Exactly. It's all about that rising and falling air and how much moisture it can hold.
That's really clear. So rising moist air makes rainforests and descending dry air makes deserts.
Precisely.
Now, the chapter mentions the trade winds and the westerlies.
Yeah, those are important too.
How do those fit into this global climate picture?
Well, the Earth's rotation plays a big role in those. As the Earth spins, points on the equator are moving faster than points near the poles.
Right, because they have to travel further in the same amount of time.
Exactly. And that difference in speed causes this deflection in the path of air currents.
Okay.
It's called the Coriolis effect.
Coriolis effect, gotcha.
And in the tropics, that deflection creates the trade winds, which blow from east to west.
Okay.
And then in the temperate zones, between the tropics and the polar circles, you get the westerlies, which blow from west to east.
So the Earth's rotation is like stirring the atmosphere.
It is. It's creating these consistent wind patterns that influence ocean currents and distribute heat and moisture.
So that's the big picture, but climate can also vary seasonally, right?
Absolutely. And it's also affected by local factors like mountains and large bodies of water.
Right, so there's more to it than just latitude.
For sure. So let's talk about seasonality first.
Okay.
The Earth's axis is tilted at about 23.5 degrees,
Okay.
and that tilt is what causes the seasons.
Right, because different parts of the Earth are tilted toward the sun at different times of the year.
Exactly. So during summer in the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun.
Okay.
And during winter, it's tilted away.
Gotcha. And that changes the amount of sunlight and the temperature?
Precisely. It also affects day length, so summer days are longer and winter days are shorter.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about those wet and dry seasons around 20 degrees latitude?
So those are caused by the shifting of the intertropical convergence zone.
What's that?
It's an area of low pressure and high rainfall,
Okay.
and it moves north and south with the changing angle of the sun.
So it's like this band of rain that follows the sun.
Exactly. And that creates those distinct wet and dry seasons in those regions.
Gotcha. So that's seasonality. What about the effects of large bodies of water?
Oh, those are really important too, especially for coastal areas.
Okay.
So water has this really high specific heat.
Specific heat.
It means it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water. So oceans and large lakes heat up and cool down much more slowly than land does.
Right, so they're like giant temperature regulators.
Exactly. That's why coastal areas tend to have milder climates.
Like San Francisco, it's always pretty temperate.
Exactly. Compared to somewhere inland at the same latitude, San Francisco will have cooler summers and warmer winters.
And the chapter talks about how ocean currents also play a big role.
Oh yeah, those are like giant conveyor belts moving heat around the globe.
Okay.
Like the Gulf Stream, it carries warm water from the tropics up the east coast of North America and then across to Europe.
Right, and that's why Europe has such mild winters for its latitude.
Exactly. And then you have currents like the California current, which brings cold water down the west coast of North America,
Okay.
and that helps create those cool, foggy conditions we see in places like San Francisco.
So ocean currents are like these massive climate influencers.
They really are. They distribute heat all over the planet.
It's amazing how connected everything is. All right, what about mountains? How do they affect climate?
So mountains have a couple of big effects. First, when air hits a mountain range,
Okay.
it's forced to rise up and over the mountains. As the air rises, it cools down.
Okay.
And cooler air can't hold as much moisture.
Right, we talked about that with the deserts.
Exactly. So the air releases that moisture as rain or snow on the windward side of the mountain.
The windward side.
It's like facing the wind.
Gotcha.
And then as the air goes over the mountain and down the other side,
Right.
it warms up again.
Okay.
And that warmer air can hold more moisture.
Right.
So it sucks up moisture from the land on the leeward side.
Leeward side. Okay, so it creates this dry area on the other side of the mountains.
Exactly. It's called a rain shadow effect.
Rain shadow, I like that.
And some deserts, like the Mojave Desert and the Gobi Desert, are formed this way.
Wow, so mountains can literally create deserts.
They can. They also affect sunlight exposure and temperature depending on which way they face.
Okay, how so?
So in the northern hemisphere, south-facing slopes get more direct sunlight, especially during the winter.
Right.
So those slopes are warmer and drier.
And north-facing slopes are cooler and wetter.
Exactly. And that difference in sunlight can create completely different plant communities on the two slopes.
That's fascinating. And what about that thing with elevation? The higher you go, the colder it gets.
Right. So air temperature drops as you go higher.
Okay.
At an average rate of about 6 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 meters you go up.
So if you climb a mountain, it's like traveling towards the poles.
Exactly. You might start in a forest at the base of the mountain,
No.
and then as you climb, you go through different vegetation zones until you reach alpine tundra at the top.
Wow, that's like a mini tour of different biomes.
It is. It shows how elevation can create these really distinct climate zones.
It's amazing. And then the chapter even talks about how vegetation itself can influence climate.
Oh, yeah, that's another fascinating aspect.
I remember it said something about forests absorbing more solar energy, but also having a cooling effect.
Right, so forests have these dark canopies, and dark surfaces absorb more heat from the sun.
Makes sense.
So at the canopy level, forests can actually be warmer than surrounding areas.
Right.
But forests also do a lot of transpiration.
Transpiration, what's that?
It's the process where plants release water vapor into the atmosphere from their leaves.
Okay, like plant sweat.
Exactly. And that process actually uses up energy and cools the surrounding air.
So it's like the forest is sweating to stay cool.
Kind of. And all that transpired water also increases humidity and can lead to more rainfall.
So deforestation could actually make a region hotter and drier.
Exactly. It's a complex feedback loop between vegetation and climate.
It's like the Earth has its own air conditioning system.
In a way, it does. And then there's the concept of microclimate.
Microclimate.
Those are those small-scale variations in climate that can happen over very short distances.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure, like the area under a tree canopy will be cooler and shadier than an open field right next to it.
Right, because the tree is blocking the sunlight.
Exactly, and those microclimates are super important for the organisms that live there.
So it's like little pockets of different climates within a bigger climate zone.
Exactly, and those microclimates can create a lot of habitat diversity even within a small area.
That's cool. So we've talked a lot about climate, but we can't ignore the big elephant in the room.
Global climate change.
Exactly. It's a huge issue.
It is. It's one of the biggest challenges facing life on Earth today.
And the chapter says it's mostly driven by human activities.
Right. Things like burning fossil fuels and deforestation.
Okay, can you explain how those activities are causing climate change?
Sure. So when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Okay.
And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas.
Greenhouse gas, what does that mean?
It means it traps heat in the atmosphere.
So it's like a blanket around the Earth.
Exactly. And deforestation also contributes because trees absorb carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So when we cut down forests, there are fewer trees to absorb that carbon dioxide.
So it builds up in the atmosphere.
Right. And that leads to a warming effect on the planet.
And the chapter says that global temperatures have already risen by about 0.9 degrees Celsius since 1900.
Yeah, and projections show that they could rise by another 1 to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century.
Wow, it's a huge change.
It is, and it's happening really fast, much faster than most natural climate shifts in the past.
And that rapid change is already affecting where species can live, right?
Absolutely. The chapter gives the example of the American beech tree,
Okay.
which is projected to have its range shift northward.
Okay.
But the climate is changing so fast that the trees might not be able to migrate fast enough.
So they could get stuck in areas that are no longer suitable for them.
Exactly, and that could lead to declines in their populations.
Wow. And the chapter mentions other examples too, like European butterflies expanding their range northward.
Yeah, and North American plants moving to higher elevations.
And even a Pacific diatom that crossed over to the Atlantic.
It's incredible, and it shows how widespread the effects of climate change are.
And the shrinking bumblebee populations, that's particularly concerning.
It is. Bumblebees are important pollinators.
So their decline could have ripple effects on other species.
Exactly. It's a reminder that everything is connected in these ecosystems.
Okay, so climate is clearly this major force that shapes where life can exist on land.
It really sets the stage.
Yeah, which brings us to the next big section of the chapter, the distribution of terrestrial biomes.
Okay, biomes.
So what exactly is a biome?
A biome is like a major life zone on Earth.
Okay.
And for terrestrial biomes, it's defined by the dominant type of vegetation.
So like a forest or a grassland or a desert.
Exactly. And the location of those biomes is largely determined by climate.
Right, because different plants need different conditions to survive.
Precisely.
And the chapter uses these cool things called climagraphs to show that relationship.
Oh, yeah. Those are helpful.
So a climagraph is basically a graph that plots the average annual temperature and precipitation for different biomes.
Right. So you can see, for example, that tropical rainforests have high temperatures and high rainfall year-round,
Okay.
while deserts have high temperatures but very low rainfall.
And temperate grasslands are somewhere in between.
Exactly. So the climagraph gives you this visual representation of how climate shapes the distribution of biomes.
It's like a climate fingerprint for each biome.
It is. But it's important to remember that those are just annual averages.
Okay.
The actual patterns of temperature and precipitation throughout the year can also be really important.
Right, because two places might have the same average rainfall,
Yeah.
but one might get all its rain in one season, while the other gets it spread out more evenly.
Exactly. And that would lead to different types of vegetation.
And even with similar temperature and rainfall, you might have different kinds of forests.
Right, like a temperate broadleaf forest versus a northern coniferous forest.
Yeah, so what else besides climate influences what biome develops in a particular area?
Well, things like soil type, the history of the region, and even disturbance can play a role.
disturbance, like what?
Things like wildfires, storms, or even human activities like logging.
Okay.
Those disturbances can really shake things up in an ecosystem.
Right, like a hurricane coming through a forest.
Exactly. It can knock down trees and open up gaps in the canopy.
And that can create opportunities for new plants to grow?
Precisely. And in some biomes, like grasslands and savannas, fire is actually a natural and important part of the ecosystem.
Really? I thought fire was always bad for ecosystems.
It can be, but in some cases it's actually beneficial.
How so?
Well, some plants have seeds that only germinate after a fire,
Okay.
and fire can also help control the growth of certain plant species.
So it's like a reset button for the ecosystem.
Kind of, it helps maintain the balance of different plant species.
That's interesting. So it's not just about climate, but also about these disturbances that shape the biome.
Exactly, and those disturbances can be natural or human-caused.
Right. So we have a role to play in that too.
We do. Our actions can have big impacts on these ecosystems.
Now, the maps in the chapter show these pretty clear boundaries between biomes.
Yeah, those are simplified representations.
Okay.
In reality, the transitions between biomes are often more gradual.
So it's not like you cross a line and suddenly you're in a different biome.
Right, it's more of a blending zone.
Okay. What are those blending zones called?
They're called ecotones.
Ecotones. Gotcha.
And those ecotones can be really interesting because they often have a mix of species from both biomes.
So it's like a unique habitat.
Exactly. And they can be important for species that need a variety of resources.
The chapter also talks about vertical layering of vegetation, especially in forests.
Oh, yeah, that's another important feature.
Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. So in a forest, you have different layers of vegetation. You have the canopy at the top, then the understory below that,
Okay.
then the shrub layer, and then the forest floor.
And each layer has different conditions, right?
Exactly. The amount of sunlight, the temperature, the humidity, all of those things change as you go down through the layers.
So different plants and animals are adapted to living in those different layers.
Precisely. It's like a high-rise apartment building for the forest ecosystem.
I like that analogy, and the chapter gives that cool example of convergent evolution with cacti and euphorbs.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic example.
Can you remind us what that's all about?
Sure. So cacti are found in the Americas and euphorbs are found in Africa.
Okay.
And they're not closely related,
Right.
but they both live in dry environments.
Right, deserts.
Exactly. And they've both evolved similar features like succulent stems for storing water and spines for protection.
So even though they're not related, they look similar because they've adapted to similar conditions.
Exactly. That's convergent evolution.
It's like the environment is shaping the evolution of those plants.
It is. It shows how powerful those environmental pressures can be.
That's fascinating. So now the chapter goes into describing the major terrestrial biomes in more detail.
It does. It covers their climate, their vegetation, the animals that live there, and how humans are impacting them.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting stuff.
It is. It gives you a sense of the incredible diversity of life on Earth.
All right, let's try to hit some of the highlights. So tropical forests.
Okay.
They're found near the equator, and they're warm and rainy year-round.
Right, and they have incredible biodiversity.
Like the most diverse biome on Earth.
It's amazing, and they have that distinct vertical layering we talked about, with tall trees forming the canopy and lots of other plants and animals living in the layers below.
And they're facing a lot of pressure from deforestation, right?
And unfortunately, yes, logging, agriculture, and development are all taking a toll on tropical forests.
Okay, what about deserts?
Deserts are dry, obviously.
Right, low rainfall.
And they can have extreme temperatures, both hot and cold.
So the plants and animals there have to be really tough.
They do. They've evolved all sorts of adaptations to cope with those harsh conditions.
Like cacti storing water in their stems.
Exactly. And many desert animals are nocturnal, so they avoid the heat of the day.
And humans are impacting deserts too, right?
Yeah, things like water diversion for irrigation and urbanization are putting pressure on desert ecosystems.
Okay, what about savannas?
Savannas are those grasslands with scattered trees.
Right, I've seen those in nature documentaries.
They're found in tropical and subtropical regions.
Okay.
They have seasonal rainfall, so there's a distinct wet season and a dry season.
And fire is an important part of that ecosystem, right?
It is. It helps maintain the balance between grasses and trees.
And those savannas are home to a lot of large grazing animals.
Yeah, like zebras and wildebeests in Africa.
And human activities are affecting savannas too, right?
They are. Things like overgrazing by livestock and altered fire regimes can have negative impacts.
Gotcha. What about chaparral?
So chaparral is found in mid-latitude coastal regions.
Okay.
It has mild, rainy winters and hot, dry summers.
Right.
The dominant vegetation is shrubs, and they're adapted to fire.
So fire's important there, too.
It is. It helps clear out old growth and create space for new plants.
And human activities like development and altered fire regimes are affecting chaparral.
Exactly. Those are major concerns in chaparral ecosystems.
Okay, what about temperate grasslands?
So temperate grasslands are found in areas with cold winters and hot summers.
Okay.
They have seasonal rainfall, but it's not enough to support forests.
Right, so mostly grasses and wildflowers.
Exactly. And historically, they were home to huge herds of grazing animals like bison.
And a lot of temperate grasslands have been converted to farmland, right?
Unfortunately, yes, their fertile soils make them good for agriculture, but that conversion has led to habitat loss.
All right, what about northern coniferous forests?
So those are those forests with cone-bearing trees like pines and spruces.
Okay.
They're found in high-latitude regions with long, cold winters and short summers.
And they get a lot of snow, right?
They do.
Yeah.
And the trees have those needle-like leaves that help them conserve water and shed snow.
And logging is a big issue in those forests.
It can have major impacts on the ecosystem.
Okay, what about temperate broadleaf forests?
So those are the forests with deciduous trees.
The ones that lose their leaves in the fall.
Exactly. They're found in mid-latitude regions with moderate rainfall and distinct seasons.
And they have that vertical layering we talked about earlier.
They do. They provide a lot of habitat diversity.
And human activities have impacted those forests too, right?
Yeah, historically they were heavily cleared for agriculture and development.
Okay, and finally we have the tundra.
The tundra, the coldest biome.
Yeah, it's found in the Arctic and at high elevations.
Right, it has very low temperatures, permafrost, and a short growing season.
So the plants there have to be really hardy.
They do, mostly mosses, lichens, and low-growing shrubs.
And it's home to animals like caribou and Arctic foxes.
Exactly. And while it's a harsh environment, it's still being impacted by human activities like oil and gas extraction.
It's crazy how humans are affecting every biome on Earth.
It is. It shows the extent of our impact on the planet.
All right, so we've covered terrestrial biomes.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to aquatic biomes.
Okay, into the water.
So what's the main difference between how we define terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes?
So terrestrial biomes are mostly defined by the plants that live there,
Okay,
but aquatic biomes are defined more by their physical and chemical environment.
like what?
Things like salinity, which is the salt content of the water,
Okay.
water depth, light availability, and nutrient levels.
So those factors determine what kinds of organisms can live there.
Exactly. And aquatic biomes also.